Most people believe thinking is the solution to their problems. When something feels uncertain, uncomfortable, or risky, the instinctive response is to think more. Analyze the situation, consider every angle, weigh every possible outcome. Imagine what could go wrong. Somewhere along the way, thinking becomes a substitute for action. This book begins by exposing a quiet truth. Excessive thinking does not lead to better decisions. It often leads to no decisions at all. The author explains that overthinking is not intelligence at work. It is fear disguised as preparation. When people replay conversations, plan endlessly, or delay starting, they often believe they are being responsible. In reality, they are avoiding discomfort. Action carries risk. Thought feels safe. The mind prefers safety, even when safety leads to stagnation. The problem with overthinking is not that it lacks logic. It is that it lacks movement. Thinking creates the illusion of progress without producing results. People feel busy mentally while remaining physically inactive. Over time, this creates frustration. The gap between intention and reality widens and self-trust erodes. The book emphasizes that most meaningful progress happens before certainty arrives. Waiting to feel ready is a trap. Readiness is often the result of action, not its prerequisite. People who act first gain clarity through experience. People who wait for clarity remain stuck in speculation. A key idea introduced early is that the brain evolved to solve immediate problems, not to simulate endless futures. When the mind projects too far ahead, it creates anxiety. Possible failures feel real. Imagined outcomes trigger emotional responses as if they were happening now. This emotional overload discourages action. Overthinking amplifies fear by giving it too much attention. The author explains that perfectionism plays a central role in overthinking. Many people delay action because they want to avoid mistakes. They want to choose the best option, not just a good one. This desire for optimization creates paralysis. The irony is that imperfect action produces more useful information than endless planning ever could. Another important theme in this part is the misunderstanding of mistakes. People fear mistakes because they interpret them as evidence of incompetence. The book reframes mistakes as feedback. Action creates data. Inaction creates nothing. Without data, improvement is impossible. Those who act learn faster, even when they fail. The author also addresses the emotional comfort of thinking. Thinking allows people to feel productive without exposing themselves to judgment. No one criticizes you for planning. No one sees your internal debates. Action, on the other hand, invites evaluation. This makes thinking attractive to those who fear judgment. The book explains that decisiveness is not about confidence. It is about commitment. Confident people are not free from doubt. They simply decide despite doubt. Doubt is normal. Waiting for it to disappear is unrealistic. Action is what reduces doubt over time. Another critical insight is that clarity often comes after movement. People assume they need clarity to act. In reality, action produces clarity by revealing what works and what does not. The mind learns best through experience. Thought without experience remains abstract and unreliable. The author introduces the idea of bias toward action. This does not mean reckless behavior. It means prioritizing movement over rumination. When faced with uncertainty, the question becomes not, what is the perfect choice? But what is the smallest step I can take now? This approach lowers resistance and builds momentum. The book also highlights how modern culture encourages overthinking. Endless information, constant comparison, and fear of missing out create pressure to make perfect choices. People are overwhelmed by options. Instead of choosing, they freeze. Action cuts through this noise by narrowing focus to what can be done now. Another important concept is that action changes identity. When people act consistently, they begin to see themselves as capable. This identity shift reduces overthinking because confidence grows from evidence. Confidence is not a personality trait. It is a byproduct of repeated action. The author explains that procrastination is not laziness. It is an emotional regulation strategy. People delay tasks to avoid uncomfortable feelings. Overthinking justifies procrastination by creating the illusion of preparation. Breaking this cycle requires acting before the mind feels comfortable. The book also addresses the role of habit. When action becomes habitual, thinking decreases. Decisions require less effort. This is why disciplined routines outperform bursts of motivation. Habit removes the need for debate. Debate is where overthinking thrives. Toward the end of this part, the author emphasizes that thinking has diminishing returns. There is a point where additional analysis adds no value. Beyond that point, thinking becomes harmful. Learning to recognize this threshold is a critical skill. The section closes with a grounding realization. Action is the antidote to overthinking, not because action guarantees success, but because it restores agency. When you act, you regain control. Even small actions break the cycle of mental paralysis. Thinking less does not mean thinking poorly. It means thinking just enough to move forward and then doing more. Part 2: Fear, Indecision, and Why Doing First Changes Everything. Once the habit of overthinking is exposed, the book turns its attention to what actually fuels it. Beneath endless analysis, hesitation, and mental rehearsal lies a single driving force: fear. Fear does not always appear dramatic or obvious. It often disguises itself as caution, responsibility, or intelligence. The author explains that indecision is rarely about lacking information. It is about avoiding emotional discomfort. Fear enters the decision-making process the moment consequences feel personal. When a choice might affect reputation, identity, or self-worth, the mind reacts defensively. It attempts to eliminate uncertainty before allowing action. This is where thinking spirals. People replay scenarios, imagine worst-case outcomes, and search for reassurance that cannot exist. The mind demands certainty in an uncertain world. The book emphasizes that indecision is not neutral. Choosing not to decide is still a decision, one that preserves the status quo. Over time, this default choice becomes costly. Opportunities pass, skills stagnate, confidence erodes. The fear that originally prevented action grows stronger because it is never challenged. The author explains that fear thrives on imagination. The mind simulates outcomes vividly, triggering emotional responses as if those outcomes were real. Failure feels painful before it ever happens. Rejection feels humiliating before it occurs. This emotional preview convinces the brain that inaction is safer. In reality, the cost of avoidance accumulates quietly and persistently. A critical insight in this section is that fear diminishes only through exposure. Thinking about fear does not weaken it. Avoiding fear strengthens it. Action, even when imperfect, interrupts fear's dominance. When you act and survive, fear loses credibility. Each action becomes evidence that the imagined threat was exaggerated. The book reframes courage in a practical way. Courage is not confidence or fearlessness. It is movement in the presence of fear. People often wait for courage to arrive before acting, but courage is produced by action. The first step is always uncomfortable. The second is slightly easier. Momentum builds through repetition, not inspiration. The author introduces the idea of making decisions reversible whenever possible. Many people treat decisions as permanent, life-defining moments. This perceived finality intensifies fear. In reality, most decisions can be adjusted, corrected, or reversed. Viewing decisions as experiments reduces pressure and encourages action. Another major contributor to indecision discussed here is the desire to protect identity. People fear actions that could expose incompetence or challenge self-image. Doing nothing preserves identity temporarily. Acting risks altering how one sees oneself. The author argues that identity should be shaped by growth, not protected by avoidance. The book also highlights how modern environments amplify indecision. Constant access to information creates the illusion that better answers are always available. People delay action while searching for one more opinion, one more article, one more confirmation. This search rarely ends because information never feels complete. The author emphasizes that information does not eliminate risk. It often increases awareness of risk without improving decision quality. At some point, additional information stops being useful and starts becoming a form of procrastination. Action provides clearer feedback than research ever can. Another theme in this part is the difference between planning and commitment. Planning feels safe because it does not require exposure. Commitment demands follow-through. The author explains that many people confuse extensive planning with seriousness. In reality, seriousness is revealed through execution, not preparation. The book introduces the concept of minimum viable action. Instead of waiting to act until everything is ready, the focus shifts to the smallest meaningful step. This step reduces psychological resistance because it feels manageable. Once started, continuation becomes easier. Action begets action. Fear is also connected to outcome fixation. People hesitate because they focus too heavily on results they cannot control. The author encourages shifting attention from outcomes to process. You cannot guarantee success, but you can guarantee effort. This shift restores agency and reduces anxiety. The book also addresses regret. Fear of future regret often keeps people from acting. Ironically, inaction produces its own form of regret: missed chances, unrealized potential, and lingering doubt. The author argues that regret from action is often shorter-lived and more instructive than regret from avoidance. Another insight explored is that decisiveness improves with practice. Decisive people are not inherently better decision makers. They simply decide more often and learn faster. Mistakes become feedback rather than identity threats. Over time, decisiveness becomes a habit. The author explains that speed matters more than precision in many decisions. Slow decisions often reflect emotional resistance rather than complexity. Acting sooner provides information that refines future choices. Waiting for perfect clarity delays learning. This section also highlights the importance of separating fear from facts. Fear exaggerates consequences and minimizes coping ability. When people act, they often discover they are more capable than expected. Experience corrects distorted thinking more effectively than logic alone. Toward the end of this part, the author emphasizes that doing first is not recklessness. It is engagement. It is choosing participation over observation. Life rewards those who interact with it rather than analyze it from a distance. The section closes with a clear realization. Indecision feels safe, but it is costly. Fear fades through action, not thought. Doing first changes everything because it replaces imagination with reality. And reality, while imperfect, is far easier to deal with than the endless possibilities created by overthinking. Part 3. Momentum, HABITS, and how small actions rewrite the mind. Once action replaces hesitation, something subtle but powerful begins to change. The mind, which once resisted movement, starts to adapt. What felt difficult yesterday feels manageable today. What felt overwhelming now feels familiar. This is the nature of momentum, and the book treats it not as motivation, but as a psychological consequence of movement. Momentum does not come from inspiration. It comes from doing. The author explains that the human brain is designed to resist sudden change but adapt quickly to repeated behavior. When you take action consistently, the brain updates its expectations. What once triggered fear no longer feels threatening. This is why starting is always harder than continuing. The mind resists the unknown, not the work itself. Once action becomes routine, resistance weakens. Momentum is fragile in the beginning. Early efforts feel forced. Progress appears minimal. This is where most people quit. They expect emotional reward too soon. The book emphasizes that early action often feels unrewarding because the brain has not yet learned to associate effort with benefit. Quitting at this stage reinforces avoidance. Persisting teaches the brain a new pattern. The author introduces the idea that habits are not created through motivation but through repetition. Motivation fluctuates, habits endure. When action becomes habitual, it requires less cognitive effort. The mind stops negotiating. This is why habits are the foundation of doing more. They eliminate the need for constant decision-making. The book also explains that habits are identity builders. Each repeated action sends a signal about who you are. When you act consistently, even in small ways, you begin to see yourself as someone who follows through. This identity shift is critical. Overthinking often persists because people doubt their ability to act. Habit-generated evidence dissolves that doubt. Another key insight in this section is that small actions matter more than large intentions. People often overestimate what they can do in a short period and underestimate what they can do over time. Small actions feel insignificant in isolation, but their cumulative effect is transformative. The brain responds to consistency, not scale. The author discusses the danger of all-or-nothing thinking. Many people believe that if they cannot do something perfectly, it is not worth doing at all. This mindset fuels overthinking because the stakes feel too high. The book argues that partial action is always better than none. Progress does not require perfection. It requires presence. Momentum also changes emotional regulation. When people act, they stop ruminating. Attention shifts outward. This reduces anxiety and self-criticism. Overthinking thrives in stillness. Action interrupts the loop. Even imperfect movement restores a sense of agency. The book highlights that action clarifies priorities. When you do something, you learn whether it matters. Thinking about importance is abstract. Acting reveals truth. Some concerns dissolve once engaged. Others gain clarity through experience. Either way, action replaces speculation with information. The author also explains that momentum creates tolerance for discomfort. Early discomfort feels intense because it is unfamiliar. Repeated exposure reduces sensitivity. This is why habits make hard things easier over time. The task does not change. Your relationship to it does. Another important idea explored is the role of environment in sustaining momentum. Willpower alone is unreliable. Environments shape behavior automatically. The author encourages designing surroundings that make action easier and overthinking harder. This includes removing distractions, reducing friction, and creating clear cues for action. The book also addresses the myth of discipline as force. Discipline is often imagined as rigid self-control. In reality, discipline emerges when habits align with goals. When behavior is structured well, discipline feels natural rather than exhausting. Overthinking decreases because fewer decisions require effort. The author introduces the concept of default action. Instead of asking whether to act, the default becomes action unless there is a strong reason not to. This mindset shifts the burden of proof. Inaction must justify itself. This dramatically reduces hesitation. Another theme in this part is energy management. Overthinking drains energy without producing results. Action, even when demanding, often generates energy through engagement. The author explains that energy follows action, not the other way around. Waiting to feel energized before acting is another form of delay. The book also discusses how momentum compounds. Each action makes the next easier. Confidence grows quietly. Doubt loses credibility. Over time, the mind learns that action is survivable, even beneficial. This learning rewires automatic responses. The author emphasizes that setbacks are inevitable. Momentum will stall occasionally. The key is recovery, not avoidance. Missing a day does not break a habit. Quitting does. The speed at which you return to action matters more than uninterrupted streaks. Another subtle but important insight is that thinking is not eliminated, it is repositioned. Thinking becomes a tool for direction rather than a barrier to action. You think briefly, decide quickly, and move. The balance shifts from contemplation to execution. The book also addresses self-forgiveness. People often punish themselves for past inaction, which creates shame and more avoidance. Shame immobilizes. Forgiveness restores movement. Letting go of past hesitation allows momentum to rebuild. Toward the end of this part, the author reframes productivity. Productivity is not about doing everything. It is about doing what matters consistently. Momentum makes this possible by reducing mental resistance and increasing trust in oneself. The section closes with a powerful realization. The mind does not need to be convinced to act. It needs to be trained. Training happens through repetition. When action becomes familiar, overthinking loses its grip. Momentum takes over and doing more becomes less effortful, not because life is easier, but because your relationship to action has changed. Part 4. A life of action, simplicity, confidence, and letting thought serve doing. As the book reaches its conclusion, the focus shifts from techniques and habits to identity and lifestyle. Thinking less and doing more is not presented as a productivity trick, but as a way of engaging with life. When action becomes the default, life simplifies. Decisions require less debate. Confidence becomes steadier. Thought no longer dominates experience, it supports it. The author explains that simplicity is a natural byproduct of action. Overthinking thrives in complexity. The more variables, options, and scenarios the mind entertains, the harder it becomes to move. Action narrows attention. It forces prioritization. When you act, many imagined possibilities collapse into a single reality. This reduction in mental noise creates clarity. Confidence, the book argues, is not something you cultivate through affirmations or positive thinking. Confidence is earned through evidence. Every time you act despite uncertainty, you prove to yourself that you are capable. This proof accumulates. Over time, confidence becomes a quiet assumption rather than a fragile emotion. The author emphasizes that confidence built on action is resilient. It does not collapse under criticism or failure. It is grounded in experience, not validation. People who act consistently stop asking whether they can handle challenges. They already know they can adapt. Another major theme in this final part is letting go of excessive control. Overthinking often stems from a desire to control outcomes. People believe that if they think enough, they can prevent failure. In reality, control is limited. Action accepts uncertainty. It engages with reality as it is, not as imagined. The book explains that thinking should serve action, not replace it. Thought is useful for setting direction, evaluating results, and adjusting course. It becomes harmful when it delays engagement. Learning to stop thinking at the right moment is a critical skill. This does not mean acting blindly. It means acting when thinking has reached its limit. The author revisits the idea of decision-making speed. Faster decisions often lead to better outcomes because they preserve momentum. Slow decisions drain energy and confidence. The book encourages making decisions with sufficient information rather than complete certainty. Completion is more valuable than optimization. Another important insight is that action creates emotional stability. When people act, they feel grounded. Rumination decreases. Anxiety loses intensity. The mind becomes less preoccupied with hypothetical problems because it is occupied with real ones. Real problems, while challenging, are solvable. The book also highlights that a life of action does not mean constant activity. Rest becomes more meaningful when it is chosen rather than forced by paralysis. When you act with intention, rest feels restorative rather than guilt-ridden. Balance emerges naturally. The author discusses how thinking less improves relationships. Overthinking often leads to misinterpretation, avoidance, and self-censorship. Action encourages honest communication. When people speak and act more directly, relationships become clearer. Conflict may increase initially, but misunderstanding decreases. Another theme is trust in oneself and in the process of learning through experience. Overthinkers often distrust their ability to handle consequences. Action builds trust by demonstrating adaptability. Mistakes become manageable rather than catastrophic. The book emphasizes that failure loses its power when action is habitual. Failure becomes part of movement, not a stopping point. People who act regularly recover faster because they are not emotionally invested in perfection. Progress matters more than performance. The author also addresses the fear of judgment. Action exposes you to evaluation. Thinking hides you from it. The book argues that living to avoid judgment leads to stagnation. Living to engage leads to growth. Judgment, when it comes, is survivable. Regret from inaction often lasts longer. The book reframes intelligence. Intelligence is not measured by how much you think, but by how effectively you translate thought into action. Insight without execution has no impact. Action tests ideas and turns them into reality. Another important realization is that clarity increases with movement. Many people believe they must find purpose before acting. The book argues the opposite. Purpose often emerges from action. Engagement reveals meaning. Waiting for clarity before acting delays discovery. The author emphasizes that thinking less does not mean abandoning reflection. It means reflecting after action rather than before it. Experience becomes the teacher. Reflection becomes adjustment, not avoidance. Toward the end, the book returns to the theme of freedom. Overthinking is mentally exhausting and emotionally limiting. Action restores freedom by breaking the loop of hesitation. Life becomes participatory rather than observational. The final message of the book is simple but demanding. The quality of your life is shaped more by what you do than by what you think. Thought is valuable, but it must be placed in service of action. When you stop waiting for certainty and start engaging, momentum replaces fear, confidence replaces doubt, and progress replaces paralysis. The book closes with a calm reminder. You do not need to change who you are to act. You need to act to change who you are. Thinking less and doing more is not about silencing the mind. It is about giving life the chance to teach you what thinking alone never can. And that is the heart of the message.